Okay, guys, before you get comfortable, come over 5 rows, please. Come closer, please. I mean it. The cool kids sit in the front. Come on. Don't let me do this every time. It is every time, literally. All right. Max, come forward. Grab the others. Little Jing, come on. There's Big Jing and Little Jing. No, Little Jing is this, but Little Jing is almost my size.
How do I advance these slides?
I don't know. She will tell you.
Okay, great. Okay, good.
So I asked Dora Epstein-Jones to introduce tonight's lecturer. We're now having kind of a crowd, at least. I'm very excited to welcome you, Jennifer Bonner. Dora, please. Take over.
It's always my first move. Am I moving it like way out of your range at this point? Okay, yeah, you know. So yeah, this is my first move. Sylvia Lavin would always speak into the light and say, "Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me?" And then it never worked. Okay, so I was asked to give this introduction. I'm a part-time instructor here at AAU, and it's with a great sort of indulgent pleasure that I get to do this. And so I'm going to start with a crotchety English white guy named Nicholas Pevsner, and in a quote of his, in which he said, quite famously, "Lincoln Cathedral is architecture. A bicycle shed is not." And this quote's been certainly misused and misread over time. But it defined, at least for the 20th century, a difference between capital A architecture and little a architecture. And the presumption Lincoln Cathedral is architecture meant that Lincoln Cathedral was more akin to Lauget's primitive hut in his essay on architecture of 1755 than our little bicycle shed, than this little a vernacular. And even when the vernacular became introduced into architecture after the 1960s in a meaningful way, there was still a sense that that one wasn't the architecture, and we can respect that vernacular but do not touch. And a hands-off from that vernacular, which for me, as a feminist and a scholar, always seemed to be a kind of double standard. That the discipline could somehow revel in its forms, such that it could turn Lauget's primitive hut into Lincoln Cathedral, that there was so much room for what Vignola called the license of the architect, but that the small a was somehow too precious, too fragile, inviolate to this kind of formal reveling, formal revelation. And so in comes, in the last part of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, a group of young architects who look at this setup, this index, if you will, this one's architecture, literally the index finger, this one's architecture, that one's not, and open our eyes to the formal possibility that that little a bicycle shed is way more akin in terms of its family heritage to Lauget's primitive hut than Lincoln Cathedral. And from this new generation of architects, a message of please touch. A message of actively working with the typologies that exist and permeate throughout the built environment, to actively engaging its forms to advance and propel entire genres of architectural sensibilities. And this group of architects, in my mind, this young group of architects, is led in part by at least a few people sitting here, of which a key person is Jennifer Bonner. Jennifer Bonner is what I would call a polyglot architect. She's an architect, she's a writer, she's a theorist, she's an artist, she's an educator, she's a social activist. And whether it's bungalows in Atlanta, swimming pools, John Portman's hotels, the glam era of 1960s roofscapes, the vernacular of the American South, or indeed bicycle sheds, Jennifer Bonner finds its architecture and she brings it to us all, including tonight. Welcome, Jennifer Bonner.
Dora, thank you so much for the talk. This is, I think, the first introduction where there's been slides and then someone thoughtfully putting stuff together besides reading out a bio, and I really appreciate it. Takes work to do these things, and I thank you for the intellectual work. Thank you to Mark and the school for having me here tonight. Your lecture series is very interesting, and I'm very honored to be a part of that list, especially for this semester. I had originally titled tonight's talk House Gables because I wanted to introduce Mall's very first built project, meaning it's not a gallery installation or a temporary work. Finally, it's a real piece of architecture, but such a short title for a project that's taken a long time to conceptualize, develop, and build. House Gables no longer seemed fitting. So instead, I propose the following title. So this is the title. It is a little annoying because it barely fits on the slide, and it's going to pose problems for the archival purposes, but this is what I want documented on the website. House Gables is a conceptual, in tonight's talk I'll describe the conceptual and intellectual project around questions of ordinary architecture. And of course, I'm not the first architect to work on this term or even in this room. But this is work that I've been trying to write about, talk about, model, exhibit for the past 4 years. And it's really about, it started with studying roof typologies in Atlanta. And all of this effort kind of to unpack a capital P project for my practice. And it is also the completion of a single family house also in Atlanta. So I'll attempt to stitch together high concept with things like wall assemblies and mix up a discourse on architecture's representation with the reality of conditions found on site. And lastly, I'll offer up a suggestion on how we might shift into a new spatial paradigm, something I'm calling the roof plan. MAL is the name of my practice, and it stands for Mass Architectural Loop-de-Loops. The Acronym is a 20th century Americanism, and it's in wide circulation. Americans love their shorthand. And this is what MAL looks like, sitting in a sea of known acronyms outside of our discipline, ranging from governmental agencies and digital technology to the best social media practices, OMG. And here, MAL sits amongst other architectural practices that also use acronyms, so firms like Foster and Partners and David Chipperfield Architects, who are both of my former employers. MAL uses short form as a way of following the long form name to change from month to month, or as our architectural interests shift for each project. MAL is interested in an intellectual project, not a formal project, which is why our architecture tends to look differently from project to project, meaning there's no formulaic formal process. MAL can also mean miniature angles and little lines, or maximum arches with limited liability. And we can always add the little C on the end if we're wanting to feel professional. So before I introduce this work on ordinary architecture, I'd like to situate the project amongst some of my previous work. And so much of the ethos at MAL places an emphasis on misbehaving in architecture, and hopefully this becomes apparent in the next set of slides. The following projects represent a cross-section of failed competition entries, gallery installations, publications, and temporary architectural experiments in the public realm. They are what we call MAL's best practices, and in a kind of top 10 in no particular order. I'll start with number 1, flood a gallery on Hollywood Boulevard. So this was a project where I bought one big large sheet of rubber and filled the WUHO gallery on Hollywood Boulevard with about 5,000 gallons of water. So all the visitors that night were asked to put on these plastic booties. Everything was going well until we had a leak. And so that very night, we pumped all the water back out onto the street, and no one really minded this kind of dramatic ending to the evening. Number 2, fly 4 drones in synchronization, scanning House Longa and House Esther's. So this is a research project. It's really new. It's from last year, where I wrote a grant to fly 4 drones around these 2 houses by Mies. It's in Krefeld, Germany. These houses are not twins, they're doubles. The rear elevation are kind of the famous elevations. And what I'm arguing here, what I'm interested in, is Mies's use of what I'm calling faux brick. So the large picture windows actually tie the 2 houses together formally. And when looking at the drawings, there's a lot of steel in the wall sections to be able to do these large openings. And so both of these drones are scanning the back facade in synchronization, moving up brick by each coursing layer. And then there's 2 other drones then observing and watching the other 2 drones do all the work. Spotting these downspouts on the building. I just had to put one on the house in Atlanta. I'm devastated, but Mies has a few I'm noticing. So when I take these digital scans and this information back into the studio, I'm thinking about what the project is out of something like this. Yes, it's a performance. Yes, it's a commentary on Mies's faux brick, but I also want to spin it into a representational project. So here we render the 3D mesh from the drones in Architect's blue foam, and I'm really interested in looking at this as a rendering project. And so really thinking about early renderings where if we can remember the way that bitmaps were tiled, and you would see these like seams and tiles in the rendering, it's as good as we could get. It was like very obvious how materials are being pasted on. We've gone past that, but I'm also trying to see, should we be looking at that again? So back in the studio, I have what I'm calling a bad mesh. It's a point cloud that's pretty dirty and messy. It's actually not accurate. I'm also combining what I'm calling a bad bitmap. So in this case, it's H.H. Richardson's rusticated blocks, and this is the wallpaper. And then the third thing is a bad bump map. So here I'm arbitrarily placing a split fieldstone bump to the render. And so I did a series of renderings. Again, these are all in search for, the colors are so bad. Anyways, imagine pinks, blues, cyans, like very pop colors. These are the materials that we're using both as the bitmap or the bump. So millennial pink brick, a cartoon made out of wood grain, vinyl siding, wood scallops, shingles, painted OSB. And so we start to take these materials and re-render House Longa and House Esters. So this is a proposal for looking at, okay, they can be bricks again, but the bricks are going to be misaligned. There's going to be pink grout this time, and the pink grout is not going to be in the grout line. It's going to be on the surface of the brick. And so now I'm starting to think through, is it from renderings, is this a new set of materiality that can be made and constructed? So here's OSB board, not OSB board anymore. It's a split fieldstone, and it's bright yellow. And then these are a bump map of a vinyl siding. Instead of doing it horizontally in the way we know siding is hung, it's at an angle, and then it has the image of the wood scallops. Okay, so number 3, make public space that is strange, or where people get married. This is a project on Boston's Greenway that was completed, I think it was last summer, temporary installation, and it was all about asking the question, can architecture be a drawing? So the project's called Another Axon, and it was all contrived from one very specific point on top of a parking garage in downtown Boston, and this is the kind of perfect axonometric view. It's interesting when you start doing works outside of a gallery in like a really heavily foot trafficked pedestrian space. These are the kind of things you can find on social media. This is what I call the sunset view of Another Axon. Again, we're using ordinary materials like vinyl siding, synthetic stucco. This is the back side of the project, so you can see the parking garage. That top corner is where the axon is constructed from. And people looking at this view are actually sitting in the I-93 off-ramp in their cars. Some of the materials. I won't go into detail, but it's a drawing first and a drawing trying to be built and spatialized in the public realm. So this is actually the plan of the project. This sort of looks like an axonometric, but it's actually the perspective. And then this is the axon drawing. Number 4, propose a perfume strategy for a public park in Canada. So the next couple of projects were a collaboration with a former partner, Christian Stainer. This is just post-recession. There are no architectural projects to be built, especially for people just out of graduate school. And so we started applying for public art pitches. And we're pretty successful in making the short list. And the whole time, rather than giving the committees and these communities and these institutions public art, we always tried to spin an architectural idea out of it. So in this case, we have proposed 11 perfume structures that would be spread throughout this park in Edmonton, Canada. Each of these sculptures is emitting a scent. It's a conceptual scent based on doing a reading of the history of the site. And we're as one would walk through, you would smell all these scents, and it would be a little confusing as to what time you are, or what time and place you are in the park. We weren't able to go and present this material in person, so this is the box we constructed. We sent white gloves, we sent instructions. All the jury should take these perfume testers and spray them and share them around the table. Did not win that one. My husband actually was a competitor on this one, and he won the job. So there was many tears, and we also decided no more competing against each other. Because I'd put far more work into it than he did. Sorry, Vulcan. Number 5, install olfactory project in the mechanical room of the Istanbul Modern Museum. So when ideas get told they're not good enough or the right fit for a certain place, you have to reuse them and you have to get that work out. So this was the first Istanbul Design Biennial, and we were asked to display our work. I think we were given like a 15-foot wall section to hang some drawings on olfaction. And so we pitched a bigger idea, which was to work with a French perfumer, Christophe Laudemille, and to get him to tap into the HVAC system of the entire museum. So he created 2 notes specifically for the biennial. This is the museum. It's right on the Bosphorus. And this is the wall space that we are allowed to hang our drawings in. At some point, the organizers getting very nervous, and we were about to get kicked out of the biennial until someone on the board heard about our idea and kind of saved the project and allowed us. So this is opening night. Christophe's like literally putting everything together. Number 6, rent a green screen to convince clients of micro enterprise projects in North Miami. This was at a time I was working with Christian in Los Angeles. It's very cheap to rent a green screen. We didn't know how to make a film or a movie, and so we're just kind of experimenting. I think it was like $50 an hour or something. We won this project. Maybe the film was so good. We proposed 11. So again, this is public art. They want a sculpture in a cul-de-sac. We gave them 11 micro spaces that would kind of restart the neighborhood economically, and was proposing a series of businesses that would be attached to the house, totally changing the zoning code in the area, which they wanted to do anyways, and starting to infect the interior of the home. So these are images of a recording studio, a plan of a hair salon, and a plan of a bicycle repair shop. Number 7, exhibit work in U-Hauls and parking lots outside of major art institutions. Dora, I feel like you've been to every one of my projects. Dora was here for the opening of this and brought Jack. It was nice. So this was instigated by a group that were putting together something called On the Road. It was a series of mobile events around Los Angeles. This was the first one. The curators were Danielle Rago, Courtney Kaufman, James Michael Tate, and Jonathan Louie. And they asked a bunch of young architects to put their work up inside the U-Hauls, and it was timed specifically in the parking lot of the Geffen Contemporary, Mocha's Geffen Contemporary, timed with a show called New Sculpturism. So inside was Frank Gehry and Neil Denari and proper architects, and outside was architects trying to launch their work to the public. This is the crew. There was a lot of us, and I would just say maybe I'm not really interested in forming bands, but maybe you have to get any kind of noise or attention. Number 8, throw a picnic for architecture. So this is one of the images that your poster. So this is another way of hacking typologies. I'm now seeing the sandwich. This is a project called Best Sandwiches, as just another type, right? And so here you see a sub sandwich, a Dagwood, a BLT, a hamburger. And this project is really about asking, this is a grilled cheese sandwich, asking, is there a way to think about architecture's, the problem of extrusion? So we no longer have to use extrusion singularly. We can now start to think about many, many layers and how different layers can stack without the kind of extruded tower. And if you throw a picnic for architecture, you also have to photograph the sandwiches on plates in this kind of arrangement. This was photograph was taken by a food photographer in Boston called Adam Detour. These are 3D prints. The colors, again, are not good, but imagine pinks and cyans and yellows and more pink. And these are 3D prints, but they've been colored with like flocking, so very like DIY craft kind of technique. So the ambition is always to take conceptual work and turn it into real things, real buildings. So that happens in the faux brick project. It definitely happens in this project. This summer we looked at making this a BLT, actually a mid-rise tower in Atlanta. And of course we had to throw a picnic for it in some park in Cambridge. Number 9, we're almost to the end. Create a discourse around architecture of the Dirty South via a guidebook. This was a project that I worked on with students at Georgia Tech about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, where I've asked the students to basically, I put forward an analogy that happens in the rap industry between the East Coast and the West Coast, and presented an idea about the Dirty South, really looking at rappers like Goody Mob and Outkast. And so rather than trying to figure out who the architects are of the Dirty South, we looked to the city and we looked at strange urban patterns that's happened over time. We clearly looked at John Portman's work. This is a student, Ian Freilich, which kind of drew every atrium and then proposed an even stranger atria project. Half of the book is actually a guidebook with real places to visit and to see in the city. Half of the guidebook is a conversation between the students and people like Big Gip, Cujo, and Timo, some of the members of Goody Mob, Denise Scott Brown, John Portman, Max Goggin and Merrill Elam, and other theorists. So it's kind of an oral history recording. And you have to get the book to know what Goody Mob says about why Atlanta got the 1996 Olympics, which is on page 120, which I'm not going to tell you. So it's on Amazon. Number 10, question how architectural models are displayed. So this was a big project for me at the GSD where I was asked as a faculty member to be the editor of a student publication, the annual kind of yearbook, I would say. But in this case, the dean really asked each of the faculty members to take it on as an intellectual project. So to read the pedagogy of the school and then package it in a way that's kind of like a quick look into that year. And so I was given a room full of brown chipboard and cardboard models and some white card models and white 3D prints, and just was not satisfied with the aesthetic that was going on. And so I did two things. One, which was to use this idea of a still life as the framing device for organizing work. So one could put work of a landscape architecture student beside an architecture thesis project, beside a core studio. And to momentarily put these things in relationship to each other in a kind of temporary frame starts to say something else about the work. The second thing I did was to look at the work of Barbara Kasten, an artist from her work from the 80s, where she was using colored light, and she was throwing this colored light onto architecture and onto what she called props. And so we produced 17 of these. It took like 7 days to set up all these arrangements. And then also, but the color was to project an idea back to the students in the school and other students of architecture in the country of like what color might do to our representations and how can we absorb color. And it's like not good at all, so you can't see it. But it's blue and it's pink. Okay, and then the book was just printed by Tongji University. It's gone into a second printing fully in Mandarin. Okay, this is the last one, and then I'll move on to the work. Number 11, throw a pool party in LA, but with no water. Yeah, this time no water. So the opposite than the first one where I suggested to flood galleries. So this is the opening night for a magazine launch of a magazine called Art Papers. It was a special edition on architecture and design, and Art Papers is a contemporary art magazine located in Atlanta that's been in circulation since the 1970s. And I was asked to be the guest editor and was given full editorial control, except that the editor, Victoria Campbell, said the issue had to be about Los Angeles. And so I commissioned 35 contributors, writers, architects, theorists, and critics to look at the swimming pool and other watery spaces that affect LA's architecture and design culture. So it was designed by the graphic designer April Greiman. These drawings are by Laurel Broughton that made the cover. She thought they would be kind of in between drawings that would be spread throughout the book, and then we said, no, it's actually the cover. These are some of the spreads from the contributors. And this is Dora's essay where she narrates 3 histories via the political, social, cultural, and aesthetic detail of an English bathhouse, an architectural installation in Los Angeles, and sun-soaked pools of suburban SoCal. And yeah, April decided to turn all the text a different direction. Okay. So I think those projects explain my architectural interests. It's work that usually begins with a question rather than a sketch, and it relates directly to popular culture. It's graphic, and it does heavily rely on art practice as inspiration. So to describe House Gables, I'd like to place emphasis on 3 representational models. 1 being the massing model, 2 being the dollhouse model, and the 3rd being the one-to-one model. And so first up, we're going to look at the massing model. Ordinary architecture is often overlooked. It's a throwaway. It's the stuff that's immediately accessible but usually tossed aside. I ask questions, what is the ordinary and why is the ordinary relevant now? And how might we flip the ordinary into a representational project? The ordinary is what I've termed the contractor stockpile. So these are all things pertaining to the roof. The lingo goes like this: eaves, ridges, valleys, rakes, soffits, gables, hips, and dormers. One of the literary references for the contractor stockpile is Hawthorne's House of Seven Gables and the hashtag domestic hats. If we consider the contractor as a geometrist for a moment, then it's possible to think about these piles of 2x6s in wood frame construction as a project of planar inclination. And I might go as far as to say that these geometries are the American version of the contemporary cathedral, which for purposes of close reading was all about the roof. In the contractor stockpile, there are endless variations of the domestic roof pitch with slopes such as 3 to 12, 7 to 12, or 9 to 12. And this is a straightforward catalog of basic roof typologies: the shed, dormer, gable, mansard, and hip roofs. They're so commonplace that we've overlooked the spatial possibilities of these roof types and to begin to produce when we flip our thinking about how they might affect the project of interiority. Current modes of construction from the contractor camp promote building vented roofs, yet the unvented roof allows visual connection to what is otherwise deemed as attic geometry. What happens in the attic stays in the attic, as in the example on the left, where we almost never see the underbelly of the roof in the vented roof condition. In the next 8 slides, I'll demonstrate even further by what I mean by close reading and offer a formal analysis of these banal forms. So Dora's bicycle shed is like, you're about to see 8 versions of that. So less concerned with the 2x6 tectonic of the ordinary, but now reading these forms as exciting massing models or volumes. So in this figure 1 demonstrates how the gable roof is covered by a hip roof. Figure 2, two intersected gables with offset and misaligned shed roofs. Figure 3, chamfered triple hips with asymmetrical extruded gables. Are y'all seeing this? I've been studying this for a long time, so, so in figure 4, there's actually a lot going on. It's really hard to write what's happening on this one. There are asymmetrical triple gables, 1, 2, 3, with a shed roof lodged in between. All of these roof forms are also intersected with 2 perpendicular and stacked gables. But let's not forget about the single dormer over here. Or is there 2 dormers instead of 1? And did I miscount the first roof as a gable instead of a second dormer? And so you can see how it starts to get very complicated of what's what. I'm about to call on somebody to do this exercise, so be ready. Figure 5, stacked, stretched, and clipped gables, also known as the gable stack. Piggybacked hip dormer nested onto 2 bullioned gables. Intersecting gables scaled, doubled, rotated, and then stacked. And this is one of my favorite ones. I think it's from Los Angeles. Front-facing gable with a camel-backed hip, plus a rotated gable and a mini gable bump in the back. So these are the banal forms that the research began by taking a fairly random sampling of 50 houses in the city of Atlanta, cut through 8 different neighborhoods, and we started to notice a few tendencies about the collection. Firstly, that the roof geometries in more affluent neighborhoods, such as Virginia Highlands, were more convoluted, elaborate, and complex, while lower socioeconomic neighborhoods, such as Old Fourth Ward, appeared to have more humble roof lines. Rendered all white, the ordinary construction method is less present, and abstraction points towards another potential construction method, which I'll introduce shortly. Object 21 in the top left over there is located in Buckhead. So this is one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the city. And as you can see, there's a mashup of 8 different roof typologies. And all of this is needed and required to cover a 6,000 square foot villa, because nobody's interested in flat roofs, right? At the extreme opposite end of the spectrum, object 41, which is right here, represents a singular hip roof covering a simple shotgun house in the neighborhood of Cabbagetown. So as the recipient of the Young Architects Forum's Emerging Voices Award, we were asked to make a solo exhibition in a 10,000 square foot gallery space in Atlanta, and it consisted of 16 large massing models measuring 3 foot by 5 foot by 3 foot in height. So I just got a call one day and say, "Congratulations, you've been given this award." And I said, "Well, I didn't apply, and what does it mean?" So they said, "Well, we have this space." And I was like, "Okay, 10,000 square feet is pretty daunting, and I have no work." So it was really a really crucial point in my career to make work to fit this kind of space. And it had a lot to do with just that simple fact, right? But then I started to think about, how do we take small things and blow them up? So there's 16 of these models, and then there's one called the mega massing model. So it's measuring 12 feet by 20 feet by 6 feet in height. And obviously in this exhibition, we're concerned with the massing model and its potentiality for architecture. So in the next series of slides, you can see how we've absorbed lessons learned from absorbing the everyday into a formal study. There's distortion, rotation, incremental scaling. We're asking questions like, what happens when an A-frame no longer produces a snug fit with an adjoining gable? Or when a hip roof no longer sits symmetrically as the primary volume? So excessive amounts of formal qualities emerge when looking at all 16 domestic hats from the top view. The orthographic representational agenda for the project involves 2 axonometric drawings for each of the 16 massing models. So one of these engages the very top of the surface, roof surface, in a kind of single razzle-dazzle drawing on the right, and the other represents the vectors required to cut the foam model on our 4-axis wire cutter. So this body of work rethinks the role of massing model in architectural representation. Massing models are usually small. They're the result of an iterative design process by the architect. They represent the schema, the diagram, or proto-architecture, often lacking detail or often made out of a singular material. Massing models distinguish differences in a volumetric study. So should we make it slightly thinner? No, let's make it a little longer, or better yet, let's make it fatter. Domestic hats delights in these tendencies to engage multiples, but rejects the constraint of smallness. For these purposes, the models are scaled up to an awkward size without the luxury of detail or information. They were not easily to transport. They didn't fit in our frame of our wire cutter. And the massing models included in the installation are not large enough to be considered a pavilion. Nor do they sit comfortably on a client's conference room table. Intentionally inflated, they merely represent themselves, no longer a representational stand-in for something else. So after the installation, we took these several members of the domestic hats team. These are friends now, and they're removed from the gallery and they're taken back out into the city, only to be dropped off as yard art on the front lawns of the original houses sampled during the original research. This person wasn't home. We just did it without permission because Michelle Nunn was running for U.S. Senate and she lost the race that year, but we were really thinking she was going to get it. And this postcard went out to thousands of people in the Atlanta area. These neighborhood friends begin to show off novel forms of the ordinary when positioned alongside standard gables, hips, and dormers. And just as the plywood has been sheathed over the wood framing, the contractor stockpile is operating at its best. Here, domestic hats is found sitting on the front porch, and it meets its match in the real example of the overscaled massing model. Okay, the next so if the larger conceptual project can be loosely thought of as working through 3 models, and the first model was concerned with representation, the second model, what we call the dollhouse model, is also concerned with representation, but presents alternative motives. So number 1, we're now interested in materials. Number 2, the possibilities for a new spatial paradigm. And I'll begin with the latter. Rejecting the free plan and the ROM plan paradigms of the past, House Gables and the dollhouse model invents what we are calling the roof plan. This is not a top-down orthographic drawing seen in a set of permit drawings. So the roof plan is not the typical roof plan anymore, but it's a potential paradigm or ideology that can reorganize how we think about space and the plan logic. Anyways, I've crossed those out with a pink thing. You can't see it. So this is the first floor plan. And at first glance, it appears not to be concerned with the roof, but there are 2 spaces that allow for visual relationship between level 1 and the underbelly of the roof. And so this happens right here and right here. Plan 2, the roof consumes the plan, while roof rooms discretize and dominate the plan logic. So in section, you can see that some of the roof rooms are actually being hung by the roof forms. And in the next set of drawings, we're working through the scale of the dollhouse model in a digital model form and through drawings, trying to spatialize how the roof plan might make inflections on the interior organization. Following the spatial logic of the roof plan, the interior materials are literally mapped onto the room, but without an overall logic. Only carefully determined by room basis. So everything that you see here in the dollhouse model is actually made of Baltic birch plywood. In reality, this becomes large sheets of cross-laminated timber panels. But we've decided not to cut the dollhouse into the 87 panels that make up the house. We want it to be a dollhouse. So the actual doors open with a cut seam down the middle, just like a dollhouse would, to reveal the section. At the 1 to 12 scale, these materials are graphic, they represent pop, and they are not what they seem. We all saw the poster, and the posters look better than this, so you know what it looks like. Situated in the American South, the project undertakes an old tradition of faux finishing. For Southerners, there is this history of not being able to afford precious materials and a subsequent desire of faking it. Seen here in the Southern Institute of Faux Finishing, this is a real place. It's in Brandon, Mississippi. I've never been. I'm never going to go. But it's an example on the right of porcelain bathtub decked out as faux marble. So this is just a normal bathtub made out of porcelain, and then they really wanted it to be like a carved piece of marble. So there's a painterly effect going on. On the exterior of the house, I'm interested in looking at what a drawing might be that's 55 feet long of brick, and what maybe two sides of the house might be made out of wood grain. I'm also combining, obviously, always the high and the low. So this is a series of paintings by Mary Corse, the white light paintings from 1968, where she was using the reflective glass beads used on roadway markers. And she's using this as a material to make a painting. So why can't we scale this up and make a whole facade with this material? So these are our tools. At the GSD, I'm working with students on this research project where I'm trying to make a one-to-one example. So we make this little brick jig. These are a pile of glass beads. And then we CNC'd a custom roller that looked like wood grain. And so we made these one-to-one mock-ups that were displayed in the Yi Yang gallery. They're hard to photograph, but basically when light hits it, you get the reflectivity. This is actually installed and built in the house in Atlanta. On the left is kind of at dusk where you see the kind of fake bricks. And on the right is when a flash hits it. It's like total sparkle. So this is where the 1,700 square feet of glitter stucco comes into play. This is the front facade, super flat. It's trying to be brick. It's not brick. And when I described the faux brick process and the fake brick stamp to subcontractors in Atlanta, they responded with, "Oh, we've done an Arby's like that." So a little disheartened, white fake bricks was already a thing in the South. I just proceeded anyways. And this is the subcontractors installing. It's just a commercial product. It's a sticky back sticker. It's a piece of paper. It's stuck onto the stucco. They trowel on their last coat. The thing that really threw them off is I said, okay, but we got to throw these glass beads into the final coat, and like it's called a dash finish. It's a thing. They were like, no. So, anyways, there was a big struggle of putting the glass beads in, but we did it. So when you see all the stickers on like the full 55-foot facade, it's kind of exciting. On the interior, there's also faux finishes. And so we're really working with, again, each room has a different faux finish. So we're using terrazzo tile. So not terrazzo is usually poured in place and like ground down, like in places like Spain or Greece. We've just purchased it as a tile, so it becomes like a sticker. It's very thin. We're interested in using a bunch of vinyls that look like marble. We're interested in making using ceramic tile that looks like a cartoon drawing of marble. And then this one here is a ceramic tile from Spain that looks like OSB board, but it's expensive. Okay, so some of the rooms here, it's not the like $15 a sheet at Home Depot. It's a little bit more pricey. These are 2 rooms where you walk up OSB board stair and you enter into terrazzo, and then you get on another stair and it's another kind of terrazzo. And then in the bedroom, can't see it. In the bedroom, there's, imagine 3 different marbles kind of colliding, and they're made out of ceramic and vinyl. These are the faux finish plans. These are some of the faux finishes installed on the site. Everything's at angles. None of the angles make sense. This is like a tiny, tiny little triangle terrazzo tile. The faux finishes are wrapping up the wall, kind of like wainscoting, so it's trying to be proper. This is a corner in the shower. And this was it about 8 weeks ago, as they were installing the faux finishes. Before moving into introducing the third and final model of the project, just to note a few things about the house's relationship to site, because that's what architects should do. This is a site plan noting 4 narrow urban lots. Each of these properties are 24 feet wide. The property came with a variance with 3 feet. So on each side of the long lot, you have to build within a 3-foot setback. So the total width of the construction of the house is 18 feet, which is the same size of like a single wide trailer. And the pink one, so the pink one's the site. And so if the other house gets built, it'll be 6 feet away from its neighbor. And the house is located in a neighborhood that adjoins a new development called the Beltline. And it's this former Rust Belt. It's a pedestrian route that connects 45 in-town neighborhoods around the city of Atlanta. And so the New York Times called it a glorified sidewalk, which we were like, fuck you, New York Times, because like, you know, it is like the High Line for Atlanta. It's the best we can do. And so this is just around the corner from the house as an access point from the lot. This becomes the domestic cat, the massing model then becomes the one-to-one model, and this is what we started with. So remember I showed all those pitches of like under 12 to 12. We're going above that, and so there's like 17 to 12, 14 to 12, and 19 to 12. So we're exaggerating the gables. So I've thrown all the hips and dormers and mansard, all that's been thrown out. They're dealing with 6 gables. They're pairs, and they're colliding into each other in problematic ways. So the third model that I'd like to speak about tonight is the one-to-one model. And so this is a 2-minute animation that shows the construction sequence. There's 87 cross-laminated timber panels. They're assembled together with a 40-ton crane in 14 days' time with just 4 people. What's super interesting to me is the way in which the real construction is most definitely trying to be real and serious, but it starts to remind me of the scaled-up model being assembled in studio or in an office setting. And if you squint your eyes, the filming of the construction sequence reads just like a model being assembled out of cut material like chipboard or foam core. There are 4 engineers on the project. Hanif Kara of AKT in London, an engineer out of New Hampshire, a group called Bensonwood. They really worked with me on design development. And then they then hired another engineer called Fire Tower, who specializes in mass timber engineering, and that group was really doing the calculations. And then there was an engineer in Atlanta that's called PEC Structural, and they're designing the connection between a concrete box basement and the connections between the CLT box. Logistics was a very major piece of this project. There was someone that was assisting me in the organization of the shipment and transportation from all the panels that were in the Port of Savannah, which is about a 4.5-hour drive to the site. And if you watch the trucks coming in on the left, all these like layers and layers and stacks of panels are getting installed, dropped off, delivered. There was 11 40-foot hotshot trailers bringing materials from this warehouse. It was very stressful. The installing team did not want too many on site at the same time. They needed them to be in order. There was a precision that had to take place. The crew, so this is the second fully CLT house in the US. The first one's in Seattle, made by another female architect called Susan Jones. And I called her and she said, you should hire my super that put mine together. And so I called Terry Ducat and said, you're the expert in the country. Will you come to Atlanta and put this together? Because no contractor kind of wants to touch it. And so he came and brought 3 of his friends, some of which didn't have construction experience. The whole thing's put together by like 12 to 14-inch screws. So it's like a big IKEA Pax wardrobe or whatever. These are the drawings. So Terry, actually, we did a few screen shares where he saw the digital model and we walked him through it, but he's really putting this thing together based on this set of drawings, which is a kind of cartoon, step-by-step, panel 1, panel 2, panel 3. And so I'm organizing my guess at the order. I'm taking on his comments, and then I'm also talking to Benson Wood, who's engineering all the connections. So you can't see it, but every call out shows every connection for the 87 panels. So sometimes it's butt jointed, sometimes it's super straightforward, sometimes it's like an inlay, sometimes like a rabbet joint. The screws are going at different angles so that they don't pop through to the interior. All the interior is exposed. This is finished product. So when they're installing, every time they hit the panel, knock it, this is the final product. So it was very stressful. These are like a kind of menu of all the different panels. Before this, I also want to mention the risk. So the panels were purchased from KLH in Austria, and they came in about $85,000 cheaper than our North American CLT manufacturers. And so you have to pay that money in full to get the materials before they even start cutting. So the engineers in London went over, inspected the materials and the process before they got put on 3 open-top shipping containers. So open-top means it's going to be on a ship for 5 weeks, and who knows what that finished product, who knows what you're going to get when it arrives in the Port of Savannah. All of these 87 panels, they're all unique, of course. There's nothing similar, nothing repeated. They're all flip milled. These are the kind of angles that are happening to achieve all of the formal gymnastics in the roof. There's stacks and stacks of these things arriving on site. Sean, he does work in construction. He's the guy organizing the crane operator. You know, a crane putting together a house in a very urban in-town neighborhood is confusing to everybody. There was a lot of people like super interested in like what was going on this tiny street. And all of them were numbered and labeled per the order, except I gave the order and then it got jostled around, and so there was another numbering system having to be figured out on site. This one needs music to it, but. So that's Terry. He somehow happened to be right in the best spot when the drone arrived on site. He's installing the longest, biggest, heaviest panel. So there's really large windows. Again, trying to do the picture window thing, but this time, the CLT is doing the work to make that possible. All the windows had to be cut and organized, before they arrive on site. So trying to figure out the detailing of the window, we just kind of went with the rough opening dimensions and said, well, we hope we will figure out the wall assembly as we go. So the risk is super difficult. But in a city, if you look in the skyline, these are John Portman's buildings. So it's quite inspiring to be working in a city where an architect decided to design his own projects. He invented the super atrium typology without clients, and it all happened in the South in this particular city. So there is kind of an inspiring story that maybe you just have to self-develop and self-figure out how to get loans and funding to make projects like this happen. I love this shot because if you can see my cursor? No. Okay, so there's a gable, obviously here, there's a lot of gables. If you look at the very top, there's a gable. So this is like the ordinary in the site. Of course, I didn't plan that, but there's a language, obviously, that's talking to each other in these kind of close proximities. Except the neighbor here, he has a flat roof. It's too bad. So it's 2,200 square feet. It's really small. It's 18 feet wide. Right after the CLT was installed, we had about 6 hours before we needed to start weatherproofing and getting the windows in, because any amount of rain or moisture hitting these panels is problematic. And so we brought a photographer out to shoot the project in its kind of raw state. Without windows, and so this is the kind of one-to-one model, and its representation is through this series of photographs. Uh-oh, what just happened? Oh no, what is this? Now my whole computer's like... It's like frozen. I wonder if it's the cable down here I'm stepping on from current slide. So it's on my screen, but it's not on the big screen. Oh, it is now. Okay, we're back in order. Okay, this is one of my favorite shots. It's of the room that's being hung by the roof. And so you get this kind of perfect gable inside of a very not perfect gable assembly above. So in the next few slides, this describes the wall assembly. So when building with CLT on a tight urban lot in Atlanta, we have to prove a 1-hour fire rating because of the proximity of neighbors. And also Atlanta is working with the city building code of 2012, not 2015. 2015 CLT is approved in code. So there's a lot of hurdles to get through. So the orange layer is the water resistant barrier. It's breathable. And so at some point the house was orange for a very long time. The next layer is a 3D mesh from this company called Vapor Shield. And so basically if water does get into the wall assembly, it's running down through this 3-dimensional mesh, and it's allowing the CLT to breathe. The image on the left is the 2 inches of insulation. So CLT gets you an R value of 1 per inch, and so it's 4 inches thick as the walls, and so that gets you 4. You need more than that. I forget what you need. Anyways, the 2 inches of foam gets you another 17 our values. And then the yellow was the DINS glass that had to be put on because of the fire rating. And so then the next layer is the wire mesh. And then we start with our first coat of stucco and our second coat of stucco. And this is cementitious stucco. And then, of course, the last layer is that very thin sticker and the glass beads. This is it a few weeks ago. It's going to be finished next Wednesday. I'm sorry I don't have professional photographs to show you, but this is the attempt at building the massing model at 1:1. Yeah, so I've said a lot. I think that's it. Thank you so much. Do y'all do questions here? Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jennifer Bonner, for this exciting and entertaining and inspiring lecture. I feel that our whole lecture series, every week we're seeing another lecture that's topping the previous lecture, and it's so interesting, even though we have so many illustrious guests this semester. It's amazing and very, yeah, as I said, inspiring. I don't know if there are questions in the audience. I want to kick off with one question. I think from the beginning of your lecture, when you draw from Mies van der Rohe's Krefeld villas, actually, you talked a lot about like the messed up mesh and the messed up bitmap and or the bad bitmap and the bad mesh and the bad texture from a building that is highly precise. And you're ending your lecture with a building that is highly precise. So I wonder if you have something to say about that dichotomy of your own stance towards perfection and imperfection. I think that's really interesting and really evident in your work, and that's quite thrilling. It causes a lot of tension, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I didn't mention, but I was a student at the Rural Studio because I'm from Alabama and went to Auburn University, and so part of my very beginning education was to build something one-to-one as a thesis student. So 21 years old, rural West Alabama, trying to build something with 3 partners. We didn't know how to build, and so we had to figure it out as we went along. But what that did was kind of empower me as an architect to understand that I'm never going to know everything about any given project, and that it's all, you can sort it out and figure it out, right? So in a way, there's either a naivety about ordering 87 panels from Austria with like such complexity and just saying, okay, people have been using CNC machines and fabricating for many decades now, it'll be fine. But it's also yeah, like the thrill of just like also doing it. Yes, there is precision here. The Mies work and the renderings is after, like I'd already started construction on this, or about to, so that's me trying to do a new project, but also thinking through the finishes and faux finishes. Obviously, like projects start to bleed into each other. I'm like, is this a roof project? Is it a faux finish project? Is it a sandwich project? You know, you're always trying to wrestle with where do you use your ideas, when and how, on which project. So that I see this kind of messy digital debris rendering representational stuff. I see being able to take that and make, like, I want to build the next building or piece of architecture with that material. So work with I don't know, probably precise German fabricators on a facade system that's pink and that's ceramic and that's tileable in some way. So yeah, hope that answered.
Thank you. Any other questions in the audience?
I need a question from the students. That's very important. So just throw them up here. So cue it up. Clark's gonna.
While the students think of their questions for you, it's such a beautiful lecture, Jennifer, and the work is so compelling on a lot of levels. Including from sandwiches to faux finishes to the emphasis on the roof, which is my question. One of the things that's sort of striking about like this view, for example, with regard to the research on the roof, is that it seems like one of the character-defining features of the roof, and in particular, the ones that you're documenting in Atlanta, would be the extension of the roof to distinguish it from the wall, so the eave or the overhang. And in your work, I get it from the standpoint of the massing model, like
Yeah.
it makes sense from that standpoint, but it also raises questions for me from the standpoint of a sort of cultural reflection or manipulations to or perversions even to the found forms of the houses you were documenting. I just wonder about, beyond the idea of the house being the largest of the three types of models, from massing to dollhouse to, I guess, house gables, if you can expand a bit on the attitude towards the separation from roof and wall, because if it weren't for, say, the standing seam in this, we might just say that the roof is actually
Stucco.
sufficiently slanted wall.
Yeah.
Whereas in the original documentations, the eave and the overhang have a lot to do with the legibility of the different roof types.
Yeah, I think so. Because it's such a long project and I've been working on it for 4 or 5 years, 3 years just on like getting the house into the world. I've been lecturing and writing about it, thinking about it, and a lot of people were concerned because it is a project about the roof. How are you going to build the roof? How are you going to deal with the water and the overhangs and the valleys and all of these things? So I think ultimately I wanted to deny the eave and the overhang as much as I could, and so we just basically jumped to a commercial detail. So the detail is a 2.5-inch drip edge, and I just have friends in New Orleans that recently built a bunch of houses, and they said, Jennifer, you don't need gutters like this. You can just do this. And so I was like kind of getting confidence from others that are also building, let's say, contemporary gables in a way. But yeah, it's this flip to the commercial kind of detailing. But your point about the roof, like why isn't, so if I were to build, let's say, those orthographic axons in this project, then would I have striped razzle-dazzle roof, and then that would set the roof off graphically different to the kind of wall language. So yeah, there was an effort to try to build that foam thing but big, but then also not in a Swiss way. Like, the Swiss have mastered like I don't know, drains that go on the inside, or like gutterless, like super smooth, like wall to roof details. And I knew that I couldn't achieve everything first because I'm like new at detailing architecture, but also because of watching construction administration from a distance. So yeah, there's just so many moving parts in a project that goes on for 4 years. Yeah, but I mean, yeah, figuring out a tectonic with the roof seems important, but not if you say the massing models first.
No, yeah, I'm sure.
No, they're going to ask one. Yeah. I know they've got some.
This is maybe 2 questions, Jennifer. One following up on Clark, and I'm surprised you said tectonic at the end, because it seems in a way, as much effort as you put into building this house, that there's something which I think is amazing, and I'm kind of stunned by, and it's going to sound like a criticism, but it's praise, is that there's a quality in the work that you actually don't want it to be a building. Ultimately, and you describe it as the one-to-one model at
Yeah.
the end, but I'm thinking about the sandwiches too, and the model on the picnic blanket.
Yep.
Looking at that, and it's like, well, okay, that's wants to be a building, because architects make buildings, and you got to take the sandwich project and maybe make that attempt. And I think it should be built because it would be the best bad office building in the world in some way. I mean, I'm just thoroughly disgusted with American architecture right now, which is maybe bad given my new job. But walking around San Francisco, there's so many bad curtain walls. They're bad, and you took, that's clearly part of the sandwiches. The surfaces are, going after that in some way.
Mm-hmm.
So that's maybe not so much a question, but I'd be curious if you would agree with that, like that at a point, it's not the building, it's the architecture, and there's the impetus to actually like ultimately make it architecture, but you're still always interested in the representation.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? It as
yeah.
a form of representation, not as a tectonic, not as a material project, the faux finishes, like you're doing everything you can to say, this isn't wood, first of all, right?
Yeah.
CLT is about the most tectonic less, if we can make that
Yeah,
word,
smooth.
material.
Yeah.
It's chipboard,
Yeah.
right? Which is what's amazing about it, besides its wonderful sustainable properties and it's renewable. So that's one. And then the other question I have is about composition, because you have this amazing capacity, I think, to almost look at anything, and through acts of subversive compositional strategies that are only slightly off the norm, convert it into something else, you know. So, I mean, it almost doesn't matter, I would say, in some ways, like what you start with in your work.
Yeah. Like what the
It's
starting material is.
the starting material, there's an analysis, a kind of compositional analysis, I would say, of that, and then an emergent compositional strategy.
Yeah, and I think just to answer the kind of ending or respond to the ending part first, there was a time, or maybe still, people try to describe their design. Like they try to explain why form arrived at how it is in a project. And I mean, I grew up listening many, many lectures of architects trying to do that because they had to explain where these forms were coming from. And so, no, they had to describe how their final architecture landed at that design. Like there were steps, there were diagrams, there were abstractions, there were processes, all these things, and that became the meat of the discussion. And so I think what's really liberating now is that we don't have, in a way, we don't have to do that. Like we don't have to explain why every single gable landed or aligned exactly where it did in this project, because I'm referencing and looking and studying all of these things. I mean, it's much like with your work, like, you know, we're looking at stuff and then we're trying to do it, but not do it, but do something else, which gets at we don't want to be like we're very proud it's like a real building, it's real architecture, but we also don't want it to be read as a building. In some cases, we want it to be read as a model, or we want it to be read as a drawing. And so, your first question, just recently, a realtor contacted me and said, I just walked through the house. It's like nothing I've ever seen before. And I was like, well, don't worry. When the furniture gets in there, it's going to look like a house, I think. I mean, I'm like hoping it does in some sense, because we need somebody to want to have a bedroom in there, right? So, thanks for the comment.
There we go. Student question. I have the feeling that's going to be a quantitative question like last time.
Let's see. Well, basing kind of off his question, but not really, you kind of said that your work starts with a question rather than a concept. Could you phrase in one question how you started this project?
Yeah, so can we look at these banal roofs, right, and then spin an architecture out of it? The another Axon project, which were the trees and it's like saying, okay, I don't care about what kind of space I make. It's a temporary installation. It's going to be up for 6 weeks. Who cares? I have no money. There's no budget. But what is the meat of the project? It's like, can a drawing be architecture? I mean, that's a real abstract, big question. Sometimes they get more specific. Can you throw a picnic for architecture? What does it look like? And then I worked on this series of renderings to produce those images. So, the questions are always disciplinary. They're funny. There's humor. There's pop. I'm interested in pop culture, obviously. I'm interested in typology and like what can be a type. It doesn't have to be the old types we know and that we've been studying for a long time. It could be new types. We can take stuff from the popular culture and pull it into architecture and not rely on metaphors anymore. Because a lot of people are calling the work postmodern. Every single school I go to, everyone's like, it looks postmodern. And so I think I'm getting better at like trying to describe or we need a new term basically. And I think Dora did a really excellent job at the beginning trying to set up like the stakes of why this is now acceptable. I mean, a lot of architects before me have done a lot of work on that to like pave the way, let's say. But yeah, it's not postmodernism because we're using the materials differently.
Thank you for the great lecture. I'm very curious about the space inside, because something that does happen when you transition from a scaled model to one-to-one is it transitions from representation to inhabitation. And as you were showing the different images, it kind of made me think of the inside of the Duomo in Florence, where you're between these two concave walls, and that as an experience moving through the building is quite unique. And also buildings like the architecture school at Cornell by OMA, where you're inhabiting a roof essentially. So I'm curious about if you've noticed certain consequences or opportunities out of space that is derived from that geometry and even extruded down through the walls to create that space as an experience.
Yeah, I mean, my experience with it so far is like site visits. Like I go to Atlanta for a day there and back from Boston, so it's like an intense 8 hours with the contractor, and so there hasn't been time to like kind of live in it or look at it longer than those like 6-hour trips. But you know, I think anytime you're working on the roof as a problem, like the example you're talking about in Florence, or like this OMA's Cornell School. I mean, y'all are under a big roof too, in a way, aren't you?
But there's a difference of looking up and seeing some nice geometry versus actually inhabiting that geometry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So some of these you're not ducking under. You can't see it, but this is like a valley. You're not really ducking under, but you are like under an odd geometry, and you're on a catwalk, and you're 22 feet in the air, and then there's a place to sit around the corner. Yeah, you're in it. What's interesting maybe is the monolithic materiality, these sheets, these we've gone to a lot of effort to not make them look like yellow Swedish cabins or something. So we've did a soft whitewashing, so it's like more whitish instead of like yellow. I mean, these photographs, you can't see, but these photographs are very yellow. Sorry, I diverged.
No, it's good.
Can you explain how it meets the ground?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's like an architecture question. You got to know that answer. So it floats. So you go down a very steep driveway. My mentors are Max Goggin and Meryl Elam. They drive past this every day on their way to lunch somewhere in the neighborhood. And Mac was saying, this driveway's not going to work. You've messed up the angle. It's not, you're not going to be able to drive down in there. And I designed it so that a Suburban, the largest Chevy Suburban, will fit. Now, I don't know if smaller cars will bottom out or not. Not sure there. But, yeah, there was an intention to, not have a front door, not have a garage door. It's bothering everybody. How are you going to lock the car up? There's crime in this area. Everyone's been speculating. But, yeah, the idea is that the CLT house would float, the stucco would float, and that's kind of harping back on, modern techniques, isn't it? But when you drive into the driveway, I didn't talk about that as a material, but basically on the interior of the garage or the carport or whatever you want to call it, everything's high gloss white, either paint or metal. And there's 5 fluorescent exposed tubes, and it's like a very bright, shiny, I think of it as like a gallery space. And then you enter into the OSB room. So every room I'm trying to flip a high gloss white concrete floor probably isn't a good idea in a garage that's sunken and all the water drains down into it. But I'm thinking there's probably an electric car and not really a Chevy Suburban that's going to drive into here.
And is the entry from underneath?
So the entry's from underneath, and then there's an entry on the back. I mean, here's a little deceit. Okay, so you see that white door? So the door was there, but when it got put in, it looked too much like a mobile home trailer. There's no awning, there's no, eave, there's no, it's just a door like stuck on, and it's about the same height as a mobile trailer, right? And so I was like, oh, this was a big mistake. So the main door is in the back, and there's a path that leads to the belt line from the back. So I'm putting the urban belt line as the primary access point, or this kind of below ground then you rise up through the house as an entry sequence.
Thank you.
Hi. Oh, well. Thank you for the great lecture. So my question kind of revolves around, you kind of start with looking at the collection of houses from the humble shotgun to a more elaborate roofscape, and how the roofscape is a reflection of the economic status of the household that lives there. So then you kind of inverse that. So how does that reversal kind of disrupt this expectation of the family that lives there?
Because you're saying this one is complicated, like the affluent neighborhoods?
So
I guess I'm interested in the perversion that you've got a house that's 6,000 square feet in Buckhead. It's far too big for anyone that's living there, right? And then they can't, whoever the architect is, the contract, probably plans offline or something, right? And they build them. That why, so that that there's all these roofs being jumbled together, and they seem to be okay with it. That is of interest. It's not of interest. It's the image that they're sold, and then there's much affinity to the shotgun, the smooth, straight, the basic, the banal, and so I think when having to pick from the 16 domestic hats, which one to build, there was an affinity to going towards 6 gables. And yes, they might be complicated. They might be arranged in a complicated way, but that again, it's going back to this idea that the roof can change the plan in some way. But any thoughts on her question, this link of the observation, and then what do you do with that observation?
Yeah, so kind of the expectation of having these gables or this elaborate roofscape, meaning something for...
Yeah, because it's the observation that I make, but then what does it mean?
You first. No, I was going to...
I think that what was obvious was, because I've worked in those realms of tacking on extra things to shift the experience of scale on the outside, and then what happens is there is often a kind of reverberation on the inside, but its real impact is much smaller than one would hope. And so what's really obvious is that, as you say, it's a roofscape that becomes a plan, and that you've designed something where roof sets up a series of experiences never designed from the outside in. Yeah. Oh, it seemed like it was designed to. When you were designing it, do you feel like your eyes were looking from above, or do you feel like your eyes were from within?
Definitely from above.
So it was, you were constantly setting up the question.
I'm in it, I'm in the Rhino model, and I'm spinning around. So, yeah, I'm also inside. But above was the primary, especially in the domestic hats, right? There was no interior. It was a mass.
But with this one, it seemed, I don't quite buy that it was designed by, with only the the drone as the observer. So it feels
No,
the opportunity that those became spatial just seemed to be inherent in the opportunity, as opposed to something that was attached.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it's a carved mass, right? Like the patio is like projecting into that mass, and it's carving.
So at what point in the design process did you decide it will be CLT?
So I'd been working on the 2x6s, the framing, whatever, for a long time, and I was just fascinated with all the inclines. And I grew up in Huntsville, Alabama, where people just throw up houses, and you walk through like for fun, you walk through like the framing stage of a house in your neighborhood or whatever, and look around. It's so complex, and it's fascinating that they just they know how to do those angles so quickly, and it's not hard at all. And it's so there was interest in that, but then when we started to look at the structure, Hanif was like, you're gonna have to put this, you're going to put this horizontal in. I was like, no, I can't have that horizontal. That's the whole thing. We have to kill that horizontal. And then so it was a folded plate, and the folded plate can be 2x6s, but this time they're laminated and they're not studs, and we're moving past type 5. And then he was like, Jennifer, like, come on, like CLT is like been worked on for 2 decades in Europe and in Australia and Canada. Like, you gotta do it. So there was a push, but I understood the benefits of getting to use it and work with it.
It's fantastic.
It's ordinary 2x6s, but it's highly glued together and machined.
That's exactly where I would have thought, and stimulated in part by Keith's comment about the sort of non-tectonics, of it, seems, as well as this question of the eave, and how it sits on the ground and so forth, brings to mind that, we may be in a kind of contemporary moment where we no longer imagine the building as, masonry or frame, but something other than. And when you said I had to kill that horizontal, right, I had to kill the beam, right, as a real overthrow of, say, this, sort of master's house, right, in favor of something that may or may not have been inspired by the the imagery of render technology, or the way in which we can envision this with a robot fabrication made out of foam or something like that. And so I in other words, I think this is going to be less and less of a look ma no hands kind of a feat of daring do, and become more and more a regular sort of pattern of a contemporary shift in in building, and that's very exciting and fits well within the oeuvre of your work. And so with that, I want to say thank you, Jennifer,
Thanks.
and thank you for being here, and thank
Thanks
you
for
for
having me.
showing us your work.
Yeah, thank you so much. That weird picture popped up.